and we'll get us going.
Recording has started.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so let me go ahead and read the script. Good afternoon. This is Martin Piccioni, Executive Director for the Board of Accountancy. And on behalf of Ray Johnson, Chair of the Board of Accountancy Laws and Rules Committee, I'm calling this public meeting of the Laws and Rules Committee to order. Today is Thursday, January 18, 2024, and the time is 1:02 p.m. Chair Johnson will be running a few minutes late, so he asked me to do the organizational portion of the meeting, calling us to order and doing our roll call, so that we waste as little time as possible. This is a Zoom-only meeting. Please be sure to mute your mic through Zoom. When you want to speak, please use the raise your hand feature. Committee members, liaisons, and support staff can ask to speak at any time. For members of the public observing, please use the public comment opportunity for any comment you may have, unless specifically called upon. In addition, members of the public are limited to 3 minutes of comment, and the chair reserves the right to terminate comment if the comment does not pertain to the issues the committee is considering. Please do not use the chat room for any discussions. Should any technical issues arise, we will pause the meeting until they are resolved. We will now take a roll call of members and guests. So all of us are present on Zoom, and I'm just gonna start calling folks out as I see them, starting with you, Jason.
Jason Orr, member.
Okay, Amanda?
Amanda Fells, member.
Beth? You're on mute. Oh,
I realized that, of course, after I started talking.
all right. Okay, Beth Spencer is present. Melissa?
Melissa Wall, member present.
Okay, Megan?
Megan Hartley, member present.
Okay, and let's see here. Present at the board office through Zoom. Andrew, how about you next?
Andrew Barlow, board staff, present through Zoom.
Okay.
Ray
And,
just joined.
yeah, and Martin Piccioni, also at the board office, present via Zoom. And I see that Ray has just joined us, and Ray, this has worked out beautifully because I just got done with all the organizational pieces. So would you please just confirm for the record that you are present with us, and confirm that you're here?
Ray Johnson, I'm here.
Okay, Ray
Thanks
Johnson,
for your patience.
present by Zoom. And Ray, I just want to point out to you that the script I just read was a little bit updated given some of the prior events at our LRC. So specifically also conveying into the record that as chair, you have the authority, number one, to limit public comment to 3 minutes, and number two, to end that early if the public comment does not pertain to the topics that the committee is considering. So I just want to make sure you didn't hear that part, that you were aware of that and all that good stuff. We do not have, and let's see here, as part of the handoff here, so we have not yet gotten to the agenda review and approval, Ray. And I want to give you a minute to get settled in. And while you do that, Andrew, can you confirm that we have no members of the public present so that we can essentially consider the public comment piece done if we don't have members of the public there, unless, you know, we will still have to ask if members of the committee have any other public comment pieces, but do we have anybody?
Well, let's start with the agenda. And are there any additions, modifications to the agenda that people would like us to consider? All right, hearing none, the agenda stands as is. Do I need a vote on the agenda?
Yes, please.
Okay. All in favor of the agenda as published, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Hearing none, the agenda is approved. Are there any members of the committee that would like the opportunity to say anything in public comment? Or are there any members of the public that would like the opportunity to say anything? Now's your opportunity.
There are no public members in the meeting.
Okay. Hearing no public members, I don't see any hands raised or any. No public comment period is closed. So on to new business. We presented to the board last time, really kind of the board acted on two major things. We had a whole set of rules that were set to be adopted. The board met in a rulemaking hearing, and there were several public comments. One public comment was very supportive of the rules that we've enacted. One public comment thought we were a bit too liberal with respect to what a retired CPA could do, and particularly in public practice. And so the board basically decided to go ahead with the rules as they were drafted and kind of keep an eye on, do we see any significant changes in who's applying for retired status? An indication that somebody is applying for retired status when they still want to work full time and, just try and avoid the CPE requirement. So I think the board will be monitoring that during renewal season, and we'll see where we go going forward. There was also discussion of the board, and I'll come back to it when we talk about what a retired CPA can do in industry. And I think, but the general conclusion that I heard from the board was, if a retired CPA wants to do the types of things that a non-licensee could do, there shouldn't be anything to prohibit that. But at the same time, the board felt it was really inappropriate for that person to hold out as a CPA retired, because they're not doing any CPE. So, and then they've passed it back to us. We'll talk about that in item F on the agenda. We can delve into that further. And I think what we really have in front of us today is a series of rules that we'll take to the February board meeting. And I think maybe at this point it's appropriate for me to say that I've been having conversations with my good colleague here, Jason Orm. And as we go into 2024, I have a very full agenda on my own personal plate, in addition to the fact that for the month beginning next week and for the next 4 weeks, I'm going to be out of the country. We're heading down to Australia to visit friends and people that we know down there. So I won't even be around for the February board meeting. But I'm going to be handing off the chair responsibilities of this committee to Jason. And Jason has very graciously agreed to step up and take on that responsibility. I want to thank each and every one of you. We've gotten so much done in terms of rulemaking this year. I think there's a lot of people that have really benefited from it. What's ahead of us today is to propose another round of rulemaking that would go to the board in February, and potentially the rules we're talking about today would potentially be effective. I'm thinking, Martin, we're thinking June, July, something like that. By the time they're exposed for public comment, come back to the board after busy season. And so, there's that whole rulemaking process we're going to go through. But this last year, we've asked an awful lot of each and every one of you. You've been at a lot of meetings. We have done a lot of work, and as I look at where our rules stand today compared to where they stood 12 months ago, we've taken a lot of speed bumps out of the way. We've made it easier for people, but I think at the same time, we've taken steps to ensure that the public interest is protected. I don't think we've let our concern for the public interest deter us from doing something that's appropriate. But you guys, I just want to say my personal thanks to each of you. You've been here a lot. You've carried a lot of water, and it matters. I really do think it matters. I think we've accomplished a lot. So, update from Martin on board direction and on additional licensure pathway. So,
Yeah, I'll take that on, but given what you just said, I just also want to say thank you, Ray. You know, we wouldn't be where we are without you. You know, I get it that this committee, this was an all-team effort, but this was an unprecedented deal. And I've been doing this work for a lot of professions for 20 years now, and I have never once asked a profession to do this much in this short a period of time when it came to really a top-down piece. And the fact that the committee was willing and that you were willing to spend oodles of time getting us through this is beyond measure. And quite frankly, beyond the thank you, what's really important is my phone and my email is changing. And it's changing because of you and this committee, right? I can't even tell you how many folks I'm in contact with now, particularly on the exam candidate side, that are grateful and of course sometimes mixed in with impatience, right? I'm getting a fair amount of, oh my God, my grades have not yet been extended by NASBA kind of, pieces, but folks are thrilled because I've had so many conversations on, I'm this much closer to finishing the exam and I can't believe this is getting restored and I'm feeling so great and this gives me momentum. We've made a really huge difference in the people's lives. So beyond the thank you to you, Ray, right? What really and to this committee, which is all super appropriate. I just want to share my life, just in terms of the feedback that we're getting, has substantially changed where it really matters, right? For the profession, and that should hopefully feel good for all of you. So having said that, very quickly, at the board meeting in December, the board, after we got through the LRC piece and at a subsequent board meeting formally, exposing what the committee had submitted to the board into rulemaking. The board also had a separate discussion later on in the public in a work session around strategic planning. And that got a little further than I had anticipated, because if you look at the context of how the LRC started out, right, one of the original marching orders to the LRC, which was also same as the marching orders to me, was essentially a vision that the board had set back at its, quite frankly, my first super substantive meeting with the board back in September of 2023, right? Where the board was trying to recover from, all the staffing changes. I'm on board now, like, what do we want to do going forward, right? And one of the key items that the board said at that time was, we really just want to do, the work that Ray just described. Let's, remove the barriers. Let's, for applicants, for practitioners, align more with other professions. But the other thing that the board also said within that framework was, hey, let's not go all the way over in the other direction. Let's not overshoot the target. Let's not go beyond kind of where the consensus is, nationally right now. Let's not break any China, if you will, right? And we've held true to all of that, right? At the same time, there were signs that really started already at the February 2023 board meeting, right? Where there was that I would simply diplomatically describe as a rising level of impatience by the board with respect to the content and the speed, or better put, lack thereof, of the national discussion, both on the AICPA side as well as on the NASPA side, around, hey, if we really want to make a difference on the pipeline side and for our candidates, we need to have a more active discussions on, can we do something, more flexible and possible in addition to, the current basic initial licensing structure where all the jurisdictions have aligned around the 150 semester hours plus passage of the CPA exam plus 1 year of supervised experience, right? That's the core of substantial equivalency that allows mobility, which is so important for the profession, right? And in essence, the board became already in February pretty impatient with the national tone of thou shall not discuss anything other than 150 plus 1, because that was the message for a really long period of time, right? Up until the December board meeting, there wasn't a lot more change to that. It was just more like steam building up because we felt like things were not moving at the national level. And then that came to a head in our strategic planning discussion, right? Even though this wasn't formally on our agenda, right? Because one of the issues that the board really struggled with is, okay, so we've done this amazing amount of work, including very much in part because of this committee did such an incredible job, right? Where are we at right now as a board with respect to, are we still in that same place, that state of framework of let's not break any China nationally, right? And quite frankly, the board felt a lot more settled and happy with the work that has gotten done and said, you know what? We are kind of like, it's time for us to set a signal here. And we're actually feel ready as a board to kind of start pushing things and become a greater leader in this national discussion. And the way they expressed it was definitely a bit pointed, right? Because ultimately they, what they did was they authorized me to start the process for us going to the 2025 legislature to add, 3 times underlined, add a additional pathway to initial licensure for a CPA of what was really the former model that a lot of jurisdictions, including Oregon, had, which is 120 semester hours plus 2 years of supervised experience, right? So that, of course, reverberated because this is the first time a regulatory board. So we've had multiple states where you had rumblings, right? But those rumblings were mostly caused from the society side, whether or not they had made its way to the legislature in those states already. This was the first time a regulatory board had done so. So I jumped into action, and literally immediately after the board meeting, because the National Task Force met the business day after the board meeting on Monday, the 18th of December, right? So at 6 a.m. that morning, I sent a message out making sure that they were aware and that it didn't mean that we weren't interested in what the task force was doing and what these national discussions were doing. It was meant to, quite frankly, a bit light a fire and saying, we're serious, we want something, we really need this discussion to start moving, right? We've had lots of discussions since and feedback, right? And because this was done, pointedly, but also very diplomatically, right? And I've had personal contact, direct contact by email with the NASPA chair after NASPA then subsequently laid out its first ideas coming out of that task force, which is not exactly what the board proposed. There are some significant differences, right? But it was a radical shift from my perspective at the national level, because after all the talking about 150 plus 1 is the only option, and if anything else will doom mobility, what we heard was almost the opposite, right? It was hey, we're working on another pathway toward licensure that's on 120 hours, but a lot more structure and, maybe multiple years around what that would look like. It's pretty complex. We don't have time for that right now, but it is essentially, with an idea of putting quite a bit of structure into that additional time and experience that would occur after the 120 hours. But the shift was really fundamental because it was suddenly, hey, we're working on this additional licensure pathway. And by the way, we're also working on, minimizing impacts on mobility and substantial equivalency and how we can pull that off, right? So suddenly what was kind of up until now prohibited territory was we're trying to find solutions language, right? And that was a really huge, huge shift. And so where we are right now is that essentially the last thing that I communicated on behalf of the Oregon board to NASBA is, the boards are supposed to comment on this conceptual draft that came out by the end of March, if I remember correctly, the deadline, right? So we will bring this up at our February board meeting, but bottom line is I was authorized by the chair to send back a response to NASBA that was very nice and basically said, hey, this is a huge step in the right direction. Recognizing that, asking them to keep going. I did write in, authorized by the chair, a little bit of a concern around the level of potential complexity of that additional pathway, because that's a discussion that came up, not just in my discussions with him, but also with the executive directors around the country after that came out. But in essence, it was also very much a signal, a very positive signal to NASBA that basically was intended to say, hopefully we will all end up in the same place, because the best case outcome would be is that Oregon would be one of the first, if not the first state running whatever the national consensus is through its legislature in 2025. So that's the current state. And with that, I'll end the update. So there's a lot that has happened on that front since the last LRC. And I think everyone here should feel good about that piece.
I just might add, I sit on NASBA's Standard Setting and Professional Trends Committee, which had a discussion about this last month, or actually earlier this month. And I would tell you that the tone of the conversation is there's definitely an intent to try and have a more structured model in terms of structure of experience, possibly based on what we see happen in some of the countries overseas, where where there's a very structured pathway to the experience model. I think part of the challenge is going to be a timeline on getting a change in the UAA. And I think at the same time that we're talking about a change in the Uniform Accountancy Act, will NASBA, how is NASBA going to look at substantial equivalency? And, once they've discussed that, are we willing to have maybe a window of time where people can make changes in good faith and not put substantial equivalency at risk? So, I think, Martin, you summarized well the direction that this conversation is going. And I think the big item we also have to keep our eye on is how we maintain substantial equivalency, because I think the board recognized that they want to engage the conversation, but we're not ready to go out on the limb to put substantial equivalency at risk, I think. Is that a fair?
Yeah. I think that's super fair. The board doesn't want to ruin substantial equivalence or mobility, and we're not there for the sake of breaking China. Right. The issue was, how can we push a little bit in this discussion, right? But we, just like everyone else, there's a reason. And I think you actually used a memorable phrase that I, quite frankly, liberally copied. I don't know if you noticed that in the communication that I sent you a copy of, right? But you have this beautiful phrase that I absolutely love, right? That encaptures what we're trying to do so succinctly when you say, once a CPA, always a CPA, right?
Yep.
That in a very short sentence captures that there's actually a lot of complexity on how to make that happen, right? But the bottom line is the board, that's exactly what the board is on board with, right? And that's exactly why we've liberalized our reciprocity approaches, making sure that we don't put burdens in the way, right? But it also means that we are not losing that out of our eyesight at the board level, when we ask for more flexibility in how somebody can become a new CPA.
Right. Martin, why don't you go ahead and move on to part B, technical rule fixes in the works.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, and I keep this super short because this is not an action item for the committee. It's just an awareness level for the committee. I simply want to, when I say fixes here, it truly means we simply discovered that with that amazing amount of volume of work, that there are errors that have crept into some of our filings, right? And there is actually two different buckets here. One is a little bit larger and somewhat more embarrassing that we've actually started fixing already, which is, just humbly saying a little bit rough because we discovered too late that in the previous rules filing, right, which was the combined work of all the rules changes related to exam candidates and all the rule changes related to reinstatement that we ran through this committee and the board process, is that somehow in the filing with SOS, the last page related to reinstatements fell off, and we noticed it too late. And what that meant is that the filing was incorrect, right? And we're going to have to fix it. So the way we fix it is entirely on the back end, essentially, because we had promised the community, hey, this is going to come to be on January 4, together with all the other rules changes, right? And we didn't want to have to change that message. So we dropped both temporary and a new permanent rule just for that fix. That's on its own little deal, so that we could still maintain that commitment to the community that exactly what the LRC approved and the board approved would actually be in place on January 4 already. It's just a little bit more complicated now, technical in the back end, because of our own internal error, right? So that's one bucket. The second bucket are lower level, and Angie, I don't mean that insultingly to to your beloved rule on refunds. But there are, errors that apparently crept in on our refund rules and some other essentially scrivener's errors and other pieces that we're going to have to essentially pull together and say, these are all technical fixes of language that was all already approved through here, but somehow didn't get caught in the final filing. So we have no plans of running that back through you. This is all stuff that you've already seen. And essentially, unless Angie tells me differently, what I'm planning on doing with that set of fixes is to roll those in with the permanent rules, with the initiation of permanent rules based on what we report out to the board today. And then when the board authorizes that, hopefully in some version at the February board meeting, that we wrap in all the technical things at the same time. So that we can get the remaining technical fixes at the same time, so that we don't have so many rules packages out there that are going to confuse the hell out of our licensees. So just wanted to say, I still think we did phenomenal work, but it was almost unavoidable with that volume that some technical errors would creep in, and they did.
And so if I understand that right, these technical changes will go to the board in February.
Yes,
They'll
just for disclosure, so that they know there's nothing new.
Right, and then they'll be exposed.
Yep.
Right, and then they'll be come back to the board after exposure to be effective.
Yeah, we'll probably try to all push for like a July 1 type
Yeah.
thing.
Okay. Along with that, and I think this is another technical fix that we all missed, and this is the one that I could tell you I am the most embarrassed about, is we changed all the rules to allow somebody to sit for the exam at 120. And we never made it very clear that you have to have 150 hours to license in the rules. It's in the statute, but it's not in the rules. And so I think it's an easy one-line fix. And this is, in my mind, this is one of those technical fixes,
Yes.
because I think all the way along, we've always assumed what you need for licensure is 150. That's what's in the statute. We were allowing people to sit at 120, license at 150. We've liberalized the internship credits that would count toward the 150. And so I think we just need a simple statement in the rules. But I think let's just reconfirm here at the board, at the LRC level, that we want to direct the staff to fix this.
Mhm.
I think it's an easy fix, but it was something we overlooked along the way. And this is something that needs to be done to be consistent with the statute that's currently in place.
There's no policy decision here, folks. It's
Right.
just an issue of, we want to make sure the committee is aware of what's going on and that there is a reason why language will show up at the board meeting. But I don't think we need to waste this committee's time around the specifics of the fix, because it's not a policy issue or whether we need to do it. It's just, hey, we just need to make this clearer in here, and I can work offline with Angie, who keeps asking me for things to do since she's gotten new clients. And so that I can, keep her a little bit happier in terms of the run up to the February board meeting.
Okay. So do you need any vote on this committee, or we're just an awareness issue?
I think this is more of an awareness issue because the policy decision was settled effectively by the legislature.
Well, and the policy with this, I think this is something we've been assuming all the way along,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So, okay, moving on to item D, and this would be part of the next rules change.
Yep.
This is something we discussed in December. A draft rule to create specific pathway to reinstate licenses that have lapsed after 6 years of lapsed status. And I think you've got a draft rule that Martin sent out in front of you. Angie, thank you for your good work on this draft. I really appreciate the time and effort you put into this. But this is really, how does somebody come back from an expired permit? And they've been lapsed for more than 6 years. Kind of the heart of this was, can be restored for just cause when a person with an expired permit submits the following. And we basically have defined what just cause is, right? So they have to have an application, the fee, complete 80 hours of CPE, which must be completed in the immediate 12-month period. Credit for programs for non-technical CPEs limited to 16 hours. They have to complete and report 4 hours of ethics. And I guess I have a question for you, Angie, as I'm reading this. Would the 4 hours of ethics be in addition to the 80 hours of CPE, or could that be part of the 80 hours of CPE? Because I'm seeing, well, I'm just trying to figure that one out.
I believe
Well,
it's all a part of the 80.
Actually, it is a subset of the 80
Yeah,
hours.
right. It's subset of the 80. I just took it from, I just kind of followed how it's done in, I wrote it down below, but now I can't remember.
No, I get it now. I was looking at the draft and the way the indentation was.
Right, it looks funny because
Kinda
it went out
confused
further
me.
than that, but yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, it's all included in the 80 hours.
Yeah, okay. And then submit proof of completion certificates. You know, and then CP hours for restoration of an expired permit can't claim on a renewal application. And, you know, there are items there that can't be claimed. But I think it's pretty straightforward.
And that CPE requirements all align with how we do it for a lapse license.
Right.
So.
And it's aligned with everything that I think this board has talked about.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'd like to hear comments from the committee on the draft that was sent out to you.
So actually, if I may, I do have one substantive question, right? That
Yeah.
that kind of came up for me, and actually, I do want to go back to the ethics piece, right? Because there's actually two different things that overlap in here, right? Each one taken separately aligns with other approaches in board rules, but this will be the first time we combine them, right? So on the renewal side and on the reinstatement side, we always require the 4 hours of ethics CPE, which we've now made, you know, essentially non-Oregon specific, right? On the initial licensure pathway, the way we handle it is saying, hey, you need to pass the board approved ethics exam, right? You have both elements in here. This will be the first time you're combining both elements, right? And usually when we have people go through our initial licensure pathway, we say, hey, if you complete that serious 8-hour course of initial licensure ethics, you know, exam, that's the national exam by AICPA, we do not ask them for additional ethics work or CPE, right? And so for me, I actually think there's a little bit of unintentional duplication in here, right? Because we would be asking them for both ethics work on the CPE side, as well as the ethics exam, right? Which I'm not sure that we really need both, in all honesty.
You know, that's interesting, Martin, because that popped out at me of the board approved ethics exam, because my question was, well, can they just present the certificate from the one that they got when they were originally licensed? You know, is that sufficient for this? Is that addressing what we want? Or do they need to take it fresh? Is there a time frame? And your point about kind of a double dip, that's a really good one. Minnesota has something similar if it's not for reinstatement after a lapse period, but if you're applying after it's been 3 years after you pass the exam, you have to show the 120 CPE with ethics and the ethics exam. And with the AICPA ethics exam, you get a CPE certificate. So there's a lot of confusion as to, can I count that as part of my ethics and the ethics exam? And you can't, but it's not clear and you don't find out until you stumble into it. So I'm kind of with you on we got to sort that out.
So Beth, question for you.
Yeah.
When they get CPE for passing the ethics exam, how much CPE do they get?
It's 8 hours.
8 hours, it's a big course.
It's a big course. Yeah.
Well, I mean, could our solution be that they complete and report 4 hours of CPE in ethics, or submit a recent evidence of passing the AICPA ethics, the board approved ethics exam in the last
year before applying.
Yeah.
the last 12 months, and they could submit one or the other.
Yeah, I think if you do that, most people will probably do the 4, but someone might have gotten licensed somewhere else and they may have, yeah, I think that might be too repetitive. I don't know.
The hard part about that is that the way, so I like, and if you see because this was actually an email to Martin, and I threw in the ethics exam in addition because of the fact that it is a requirement for an initial license. The statute makes it very clear for you are getting an initial license, but these aren't necessarily initial licenses, right? Like when these were expired that we're going to restore, right? So just so you know, I didn't put that in there in any way of trying to, like, I was just like, this is just everything you could do, right? Like, so I was just throwing it in there for that purpose. You don't need to keep it in there. The hard part, I think, Ray, with doing it as an either or is that you'd have to pull the 4 CPE hours out of where it is now. Or I guess you could just add it. It might get confusing because right now you have 80 hours of CPE, and this is the 80 hours of CPE that you have to, the specifics of the 80 hours. And then in theory, right, the ethics exam thing is separate. You might be fine just to take out the ethics exam thing. I mean,
So I'm,
I think we need the ethics exam because we're reissuing, this is reissuing an initial license.
I don't think we necessarily need it. I just am saying, like, that's the reason I put it in, is because it is a requirement for an initial license, but that's not what this is. So
I know it's not what this is, but the committee needs to decide essentially if at a policy level, does the committee view kind of the serious matter of somebody being lapsed for a really long period of time, then expiring, then wanting to come back, right? Is that, in the committee's view, essentially most similar to the requirements for initial licensure, right? Should we treat it almost the same, right? And if so, does the committee feel like, given that, should we require essentially a fresh 8-hour course, or does the committee feel like, no, it's really just a restoration and they've done it once already at some point, so let's just go with the CPE course? So I think that's really the policy decision that the committee here needs to weigh.
well, and that's what I was going to ask. We have an expired license, so we have somebody who's met all the requirements. We could also put in here that they have to pass the CPA exam, right? I mean, because that's one of the original requirements. But I wonder if we think it feels more like a penalty because they were quote unquote naughty because they let their license be expired. And if that's our feeling, then it feels like, to me, we would penalize them some ethics CPE, that they would have to do more ethics CPE, but not necessarily the original exam, because the original exam is, they've already done it.
The exam changes, the ethics exam changes a lot because it is a CPE course, so it's constantly evolving. So it's new content. You could remove the complete 4 CPE hours in ethics and require it to be 8 and say, for example, the AICPA, or specifically say the AICPA ethics course. Because one could say that not renewing your license or putting in a safe and active status and letting it expire is an ethics and professional conduct violation, right?
Yeah, and I think we want to leave it at a board-approved ethics
Yeah.
exam. Because we don't want to specifically state AICPA.
Sure.
In part
I think-
because there are people in California that California has its own ethics exam that they might bring in. But I guess the real question, I'd like to focus the question right on the ethics issue. 4 hours of CPE or the exam, which is your preference?
Well, if you think about it, an expired permit is somebody who's not renewed for at least 6 years, right? And so
Right.
normally that means that's 3 renewal cycles by which an active licensee would have taken 12 hours of CPE in order to get those renewals anyway. So I don't think it's too much of a bar to say you need the 8-hour exam again to get your license, because they're already, that's still less CPE hours than there would have been had they just stayed actively licensed in the meantime. So that's my thought, that it would be okay to say, yeah, you need to keep the exam course and omit the additional 4-hour line, I guess would be my.
And potentially substantially more, because remember, this is a rule that we're writing that could impact somebody who not only was in lapse status for 6 years, but could have been in expired status for, let's say, 10 years.
Right.
So requiring a minimum of 8 hours to get back in at that point, I don't think is unreasonable.
Megan, Jason?
Yeah, I think I'm leaning to Amanda's point, especially because too, like it's just so
critical that, it's like those reminders and that behavior and, it just underlies everything. And I worry if we don't put, something hefty like that in, it will just maybe not get the attention it deserves.
I and my firm sat through 4 hours of ethics training on Monday, broadcasting in the snow and all sorts of fun. And we do it firm wide. That way everybody's got it every 2 years and it reduces surprises in June. And I'm thinking about that experience. I like what's been said, maybe 8 hours of ethics CPE and not the exam. Because both, I'm not sure what we're accomplishing by the both, other than, as I think Beth said, we're saying you were naughty. So no, maybe Melissa said you're being naughty. So we're gonna slap your hands a little bit here. But that 4 hours of ethics CPE, I've been through it a lot. But even so, every time I go through, there's something said that I think of differently, or frankly, there's new rules. Something's come up and there's something new. So I like that idea of 8 hours of ethics CPE, but no exam.
This is Andrew. The AICPA has two identical products for the 8 hour. One is the initial for initial licensure, which is the test, and then it has an identical product number, which is the same CPE course, just without the test.
Yeah, the difference is one is at 90% pass to meet this requirement, and the other is at the 70% pass for QAS courses. So,
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was curious about. I'm like, don't you have to take an assessment to get the credit?
Yeah, it's just a lower score.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
One provides us a completion certificate with their score. The other one, when we've had people submit, just gives us CPE hours with no score on it.
Yeah.
And I mean, for us, we don't go through the AICPA self-study course. We partner with the OSCPA and it's a live person, which frankly is better for me from a learning style. So any way they want to get it, I think is fine. But you're right, Andrew, AICPA, good resource. And they could do it that way.
I guess my only hesitation on that is like, if it's not penalty and it is truly just like, we want to remind them, update them on the latest. I mean, Jason, after that 4 hours, were you like, gosh, I could use another 4 on covering even more? I mean, there's only so much sort of more, so much to cover on the topic.
I agree. And in fact, ours was a mixture of Washington and Oregon. So enough Washington was covered, and under Oregon, under the new rule, that's good because we have some licensees that are both Washington and Oregon. So we took care of their ethics CPE ones. And Megan's right. I will admit at the end of that 4 hours, I wasn't saying, boy, I wish there was another 4 hours to this course. I really wish there was another 4 hours.
I wonder what they didn't cover. Yeah.
And by the smiles and laughter of other licensees, all of you wish that it was an 8 hour course that was required, and maybe we can do something about that. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess as I'm listening to conversation and my own view would be some of these people could have been out for a substantial period of time.
Yeah.
It could be 10 years, it could be 20 years.
Yep.
And if that's the case, I'm more comfortable, quite honestly, saying both D and E, which is pass the board approved ethics exam and renew your experience. And I think the combination of that, you've been out long enough, this gives you a pathway, and it gives you a good pathway, quite honestly, to come back in without having to go back and retake the CPA exam, which is such a hurdle for people.
Well, and I also, I'm so sorry.
So in my view, I'd be happy to just drop the reference to the 4 hours of ethics CPE and leave the rest in place and have them take the ethics exam and have them redo their experience.
Ray, I really like that, because when you say 4 hours of ethics, they could choose 4 hours of behavioral ethics that don't have anything to do with professional conduct and ethical behavior as a CPA. And that's really what we want them to be refreshed on. And so if we say a board approved ethics course, we know the minimum requirements are going to be covered. And we're not getting someone saying, fraud as a CFO, or, some of those behavioral ethics courses you can take from vendors.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that.
That's a really excellent point, even though my former behavioral health self is right now, hurting a little bit internally, but it makes perfect sense.
So, if we approve to go forward with this as drafted by Angie, dropping 2C2, drop the line that says complete and report 4 hours of ethics CPE. And then just keep everything else as drafted.
Well, I'm going to add proof of passing a board approved ethics exam with a score of 90% or higher within the 12-month period immediately preceding the date the application for a restored permit is received at the board office.
And I
That's
think,
good. Yeah.
I think
I like
one of the
that.
questions is if they get CPE for taking that board approved ethics exam, can that count towards their 80 hours?
That's a great question,
Great.
because it is a
Good
point of
question, Melissa.
confusion.
That is a great question. Quite frankly, I don't know. I shouldn't weigh in substantively, so I'll stop there. That's for the committee to decide, but I think it's a fantastic question.
So Beth, I think you spoke to this point earlier, and I apologize, I don't remember exactly what it was that you said there with the, when you take the exam that requires a 90% pass rate, do you also, you're saying that also then suggests an 8-hour CPE certificate?
Yeah,
It's
you
not
get
just the pass rate. Okay.
what the board staff get from the AICPA. I don't know if it's identical to what the people who take the 90% exam get, but we see that often, and it's presented to us as CPE credit, and we apply it to their infirm requirements, and it has the credits on it. I will say Minnesota's especially punitive about it and not allowing it to count toward the 120. And sort of to Jason's point, if you've already taken that 8 credits around what's really the essence of being a CPA, right? And then you're like, well, that's not good enough. Now you need to do 80 on top of that. That feels a little weird to me. It's like, no, we want this. I would be more in favor of the 8 part of the 80.
I agree.
I agree.
And so with somebody,
I have no problem with that at all.
okay, so with someone who has been out of, well, we'll say hopefully out of practice, somebody whose license has been expired for at least 6 years, we're okay with 10% of their reinstatement CPE being ethics, and potentially leaving 72 hours of topics updates and those types of things.
Because they're going to have at least a year of experience as well. Supervised experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Angie, I think the thought is, as you redraft this, I like what you said about the score of 90 or higher in the last 12 months, right? And we'll let any CPE earned in passing the ethics exam or up to 8 hours of CPE can count toward.
Yeah, and I don't know that we need to put that in the rule. I mean, because it is just how I think the only thing, I guess, Martin or Andrew, from you guys, I mean, it wouldn't normally go in the rule, right? Like how we add up that, and it would be sort of like weird because it'd be like, if you get this, like you can use it, but that would just normally be a part of how the board staff applies it.
Wouldn't this simply be taken care of by means of the indentation that it basically says, hey, you need 80 hours of, CPE, and then one of the items in there is that board approved ethics exam.
Yeah,
It's
you need
really
80 hours
clear.
of CPE, which includes 8
Right.
hours for passing with a 90% score or higher, the board approved ethics exam.
Well, but the ethics exam isn't CPE necessarily, right? It's
Yeah,
CPE. It's an
yeah.
exam, and then maybe you also get credit for it too, but you would just submit your credit. Sorry, I have a cold. As part of that, but it's not normally it wouldn't be under CPE because it's an exam. You're taking an ethics exam.
Well, it's actually an open book exam that's a CPE course they call an exam.
Oh.
I know that sounds weird, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so the only state that I know of currently that actually has an exam is Wisconsin, and you don't get credit for it, right?
And I don't know how how does the California one work?
It's credit. Yeah, they get a certificate of completion at the
I
end.
mean,
of
all
it.
you're doing though, right, is like so you'd have to submit two things, right? You'd have to submit proof of passing it by a certain amount. I mean, I don't know. Is it one piece of paper that all that stuff is
One
on?
piece of paper that says 8 CPEs and the score of,
Yeah.
90 or whatever it is percent. Yeah.
Then
Someone, in theory, the way this is written, someone could, well, it says ethics exam, but like Texas accepts professional ethics for credit course now in lieu of I believe. So then would that be okay, or does it need to be that AICPA 8-hour course? Because if it needs to be the AICPA one, we should say that, but I don't.
well, no, we have it. It's defined.
Yeah.
In
Okay.
rule, the ethics exam is defined in definitions.
Yes.
So under
Good.
what?
And that's
qualifies.
that's defined currently as the AICPA ethics exam or the California PEth.
So I mean, I can add to the thing that says, something about like, but I mean, it really would just happen at the staff level, or they would just add that, include that.
I think the direction of the committee is that if somebody gets CPE in the process of completing the ethics exam, they can count it toward the 80
Right.
hours.
Yeah.
Right. And we'll leave, I'll leave the drafting to Martin and Angie.
Could you, I don't know, Angie, if you ever do this in these types of like formal rule writings, but could you do it like in a little footnote, like any CP after the 90% or higher, or footnotes like a no.
No. For the Secretary of
Okay.
State, they would frown upon
How
that.
did I know that footnotes were probably not copacetic?
I
Okay.
could do like a parenthetical or something like
Yeah.
that. That's what I was thinking. I could do something like, if you receive credit for this.
Exactly. It counts towards your 80.
Right,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I could do
Well,
something like that.
Well, and I wondered if it could be under 2C(2), if we could just change that to say that CPE hours received in taking the board approved ethics exam can count towards the 80 hours or something like that.
I'll figure out a way to fit it in somewhere.
I like that, because if you are silent on it, when board staff create fiefdoms, which happens in many states, and it's silent, right? Yeah, I know, and it's silent. That's an area where they can turn into this is the hill I'm going to die on, and you're not going to get credit for it.
Right. All right. I think we've got direction on that. Martin, do you need any kind of a motion, or you've got, I think, clear direction from the committee here?
I think
we're unanimous on where we want to go.
Yeah, but you guys should vote to recommend to the board to adopt this rule.
All right, then I would have a
Wait just a minute. Don't we need to talk about the fee still though?
Yes, thank you very much. And I don't even know, actually, I put that in there, but Martin, is that even something we get to discuss, or is that Daz has to weigh in on that?
This is actually a whole other discussion, and I actually I want to hear on that piece. I want to hear kind of a little bit of a recommendation from the committee in terms of how they want us to approach it. But there's a very technical piece, because there's specific rules around how we actually get to adopt fees. Because if this becomes a new fee, there's specific rules that apply in terms of how state agencies get to establish fees or not. So I have to, make sure that we jump through those hoops as well. And Angie, just so that you can be ready for this, one of the questions that I will have for you is there a way for us to simplify that process by tying it to a fee that already exists, that was already established somewhere in rule, or is that?
Well, that's why, I walked through that, so basically it's tied to how we would do it for a lapsed person. So So I said, if a licensee is lapsed and seeks to reinstate a lapsed license, they currently have to pay $225 plus the active renewal fee for each renewal period that the license was lapsed. The biennial renewal application is currently $255, and this is Angie math, so you might want to double check it. I'm not a CPA. And keeping with that math and assuming that it would be one fee no matter how long the permit had been expired, the fee would be $990.
I did
So with
check
the-
your math, Angie, and I liked it.
Okay. It's like the one time I got it right.
That means their license has been lapsed for 6 years.
Well, yes, because that's the maximum of the lapse. And what it also means, just at the policy level, is that it would not matter for purposes of calculation of this fee on how long they were in expired status. That essentially the policy decision here is, can we simply base this fee on the presumption, which will be true for everybody, that this rule only applies to those that were in 6 years of lapse status and then fell off the wagon entirely. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. If you keep adding a fee for every renewal period where somebody's been out for a long time, and they may have been out for personal reasons, that there are good reasons that people don't renew. There's no point in being punitive here. I think setting a cap of, if somebody's been lapsed for the period for 3 years, 3 renewal periods, then it's a $990 fee to come back. And I think it makes it clean. I think it's pretty straightforward.
And they have experience. So that means they have been working. And most likely, if they're working, they're under a firm and the firm's going to help them. So it's not like we're telling someone who's had a terrible life event that they have to pay this prior to being able to earn a living again.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Because
Amanda, you had a thought?
Yeah, well, okay, so if we renew from a lapsed license, essentially that license becomes as if it never expired in the first place, right? So, which is part of what justifies that paying all those back fees, because their license then is essentially reinstated as valid from that lapse back to that period, to cover that period, right? So,
no, it doesn't
No?
work like that. No, so
oh, okay.
no, because what that would essentially do, right, was then say like, it's okay if you practiced at that time. So no, it doesn't do that.
Oh, yeah. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
So in this case, their expired permit, it's essentially their license would be, I guess, effective kind of in the same manner. Are we assuming that somebody with an expired permit is automatically renewing to active status? Could they go through this to come back to inactive or to retired status?
if I may,
I mean, I don't know if they would want to, but is that an option?
yeah, and that's a whole other we will open up a huge can of worms. I think our focus needs to be on the active piece, because that's really where the action is at.
Okay.
Level of complexity is essentially increased. It's manifold if you open up other options from lapse status, right? It's one thing for people to move between different statuses of non-expired licenses, right? Lapsed to inactive, lapsed to so on. But once you fall off the wagon, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we should just focus on the active piece, because otherwise the next conversation is, should we have people go through the initial licensure process but never intend to become actively licensed, right? And I'm not sure we want to be the first ones through that gate.
Fair enough. And so I think that makes sense then. So we could then so they would have to come from expired to active. And then once they hit that bar, then they can move to whatever other license status they would need, but they have to hit that active bar first. So I think that makes sense. In that case, sorry.
So Angie, in light of that, do we need to change the language to say restored to active, or is the concept of restoration defined as being brought back to active?
I actually think Beth has made an excellent point there, Angie. I think
Um,
just for clarity, we should just say active.
Okay,
So then with
Correct.
that, tying that back to the fee,
Restoration of an expired permit to active status
Yep.
or something like that.
so then tying that back to the fee question, would we need to state a specific fee, or can we say a fee in the amount equal to like a restoration to active status, or like a lapse, in line with the lapsed fees for active status or something like that? That way we're not can't be perceived as setting a new fee, maybe with a time limit on it or something. Can we just reference that other method? Because that essentially would be following the same logic, right?
I think what I heard from the committee is that the committee feels comfortable with the logic of let's take the 6 years of lapse status and essentially pull in the active level renewal fees for that piece to get to the, magic Angie math number that is sitting on this document. And I felt a comfort zone. And if that's still true for this committee, then I feel like the technical way of how we express that, I think you can leave that to Angie and I in figuring out how that
Okay.
works.
Perfect.
Jason?
I have a question. If we've worked our way through that, I have a different question about one piece of language.
Okay.
Martin, if I told you that I found this awesome person to come work at my public accounting firm, and we hired them, even though they had a lapsed license,
Mm-hmm.
isn't there something in rule where you're going to come put your arm around me and say, excuse me, Jason, how come you, didn't you read this piece here where those with an expired license are prohibited from working?
no, if you're
Yes.
expired, you're fine. If you're lapsed, you're not.
Okay, so if you're expired, you're fine. I was worried that we were requiring them to get this experience, and then there's no way to do that legally. So
that's if you're
since they're
expired.
expired,
Mhm.
we're good.
Right,
Since you
because
expired, it means
Perfect.
you don't have a license, which means that you're in exactly the same position as somebody who you hire as a, whatever it is, 26-year-old out of college and has nothing yet and is moving up the non-licensed ranks of your firm as they try to make it through the process, except that those folks wouldn't have to make it through the exam process.
Exam process.
Being
Perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure.
That's the way it works, but I'm so glad you asked because there's a ton of people that get confused about the difference between lapsed and expired, and there's a world of difference between the two because lapsed is still an actual license, and expired means you literally do not have a license anymore, and you're exactly the same as somebody who never had a license. And what we're really trying to do with this rule is saying, even though you're technically treated like someone who doesn't have a license at all, we will recognize that you had a license and we're creating a pathway for you to get it back.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for mentioning that there's at least 2 other people out there with that same confusion.
Oh, there is a ton. Oh my goodness. We run into it all the time.
We're inviting
Thank you.
people to come in from the wilderness.
Exactly.
Yes, that's
Come
right.
back into the fold. You've been in the fold before.
Yep.
There's a way back in, that's right.
Yep.
It's doable, and you don't have to go back and retake the exam.
Exactly.
Exactly. Thank you.
Jason, actually, this is brilliant because what it tells me is that if this thing becomes real and moves through the board process and becomes a rule, one of the things I'm going to put in the talking points when we present what it is that we've done here is to use it as an opportunity to re-clarify out there the difference between what an expired person with an expired license is and one with a lapsed license, because that's a compliance and a liability issue for firms just as much as it is for the individual. Because when we have those cases where somebody with a lapsed license is in a firm, right, we have 2 cases, one with a firm and one with a licensee.
Right.
I want to keep us moving so we can stay on target. Martin, I think you and Angie have everything you need.
Yep.
Yeah, we're good on what the fee is. You can manage the fee issue, and we're not gonna pile on with this person with, they've been out forever, that it could cost them a life savings to get back in. It's not gonna happen that way. All right. That said, the next point of discussion relates to, we currently have an 8-year window in which somebody has to complete education, experience, the CPA exam and the ethics exam.
Ray, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Was there a motion we had to do, Angie, around this?
Oh,
Yes, yes, sorry, yep. Just that you, that there's a vote to recommend to the board to adopt the restoration of
there's a
expired
vote.
permit.
All right, there's a vote. Thank you for keeping me on target. So there's a vote to
Is there,
adopt.
I guess, Ray, you should say, is there a motion to?
All right, can somebody put a motion on the table regarding our discussion of restoration of an expired permit?
I move we recommend this to the board.
And recommend
Recommend that the board adopt the restoration of an expired permit draft rule.
As discussed.
Based on Angie's draft, as we've discussed the changes for ethics CPE and the fees for associated with, for coming back in.
I so move.
Second.
Second, we have a motion, a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Same sign. Any abstentions? Motion passes. Good work, people. All right, the next item we have to move on to is if a candidate is not complete, there are 4 E's in an 8-hour window. 8-year window, not 8-hour window. I'm sorry. So you've got, every once in a while we have somebody fall outside of this, right? And if they fall outside right now, then it's go back and start over, and that means start over with the exam often. So our goal here is to try and do something, and we've got in front of us kind of what Washington does, and Washington allows a pathway back in doing CPE. And I think Washington also requires that the experience be recent. Right?
Yeah, relatively recent. I was actually surprised when I pulled the physical language from their WAC, the Washington version of rule. And it actually simply says that the experience requirement has to be within the 8 years of that window, right? So it can't be, if somebody, has passed the exam 20 years ago, they actually say, and then wants to come in, right? They basically require the CPE, and they want to make sure that the experience is at least 8 years. I'm not saying that the 8 years is, that's where we have to land, right? But I really liked the concept of, if somebody's been, if there is this long distance between them passing the exam and, if they take a really long time to go through that process, requiring some level of recency, whatever the committee here thinks recent should mean, seems to make a lot of sense.
I'm going to share my thoughts on this, and I'm going to welcome. The last time we talked about this, we talked about it in terms of allowing somebody to have you do 80 hours of CPE, because we didn't want them to go back and redo the exam.
Yep.
Right. And that all makes sense. But the longer the window is, if we're asking somebody who's been away for 6 years to redo their experience, and that year of experience has to be in the last 3 years, which is what we just talked about, it strikes me that it's appropriate to do the exact same thing here. And that what our goal in drafting the rule was, there's a pathway back in, And the pathway is 80 hours of CPE in the last 2 years, which is, let it include the 4 hours of ethics. And the experience has to be in the last 3 years, because that's what we've done for a lapse license. Let's model these the same way.
Yeah,
That's kind of where I would be coming from.
kind of on that point, Ray, I think that's really wise. Maybe we do the ethics exam here too, to have recency
Okay.
on that.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
so essentially, once you pass the exam, you never have to pass it again, so long as you can show that you've passed it. However, the rest of the initial licensure requirements do need to be done within the 3 years prior to application. I think that's fair. We're talking about somebody who's never licensed before, right? So they're new, in theory, new to the profession. So making sure that all of that initial hurdle is recent, I think is fair.
I like that too, because somebody who passes the exam is working in industry where they don't have a qualified supervisor, have a great job for 10 years in industry, and then come out and decide they want to be in public. Great. Now they have to do the CPE, take the ethics exam, but they still have the exam. And they get
They
the
still
year of
have the
experience
exam, and
under
they
qualified.
and they have the experience too. It's not just taking CPE.
Right. They've got the 1 year of new experience under a qualified supervisor.
Right.
I like that.
Well, that's really awesome, because given kind of this kumbaya that we just had on the committee around this issue, I almost hear the song from Angie coming that since it's so similar to the other piece, she might be willing to draft both.
Wait, what? I was looking at something else. What am I doing?
What am I doing?
You basically just said.
Martin was just checking to see if you were really still.
No, I was just
yeah.
looking to make sure there wasn't a requirement in statute that anything be done, like, whatever. I was looking at that. So sorry.
No, that's all right. In essence, what happened is that people loved so much where we ended up with, and what you really helped us get to in the rule that we just finished with and voted on, that in essence this committee just decided this exact same approach of requiring experience to be within the last 3 years, and the CPE approach, including the 8 hour the initial license exam. Right, that we would really like that to be essentially modeled exactly in this rule as well, so that it's consistent, right? So you can pass the exam anytime you want to, but then all the other pieces have to be recent, i.e. the experience within the last 3 years, and the 80 hours of CPE, including counting of the initial license. Ethics CPE that gets you 8 hours, that can count toward the 80. That would have to be within the last, I think 12 months is what was in the other rule.
Okay, so what, these rules already exist though, so we're going to change the ones that are already there.
Yes, because now they basically, the way our rules are written right now is you have an 8-year window, and you are, well, I don't know of an appropriate word in a public setting, what happens after the 8 years, right?
Okay.
Good. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
So basically what we're saying is the route back, if you fall outside the 8-year window, is 80 hours of CPE, redoing the ethics exam, and your experience has to be within 3 years of making the application.
Wait, you're going to ask an initial applicant to do 80 hours of CPE?
Well, because their CPA exam has expired.
Oh, okay.
You're asking them the way they kind of keep, not instead of having to go back and redo this CPA exam.
Meaning
that they can come in if they haven't completed all the 4 E's in the 8 years. Then they have to, the way they avoid retaking the CPA exam, in essence, is the 80 hours of CPE.
So in essence, we can keep the 8-year window the way it is in our rule, but then add on, if you don't make it by the 8 years, here's how you come back, right? And the comeback avoids them taking the CPA exam, but does involve the recency of the supervised experience requirement within the last 3 years and the 80 hours of CPE within the 12 months, and that 80 hours needs to, can include the credit from the other requirement, which is the initial licensure.
Did you say the supervised experience was 3 years?
Well, yeah,
Supervised experience requirement has to be within the 3-year period prior to the application for
Okay.
initial licensure.
And then the ethics exam the same way too.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
and we're basically modeling what we did for the lapse. The person who falls outside the 8-year window does something very essentially similar to what happens with the person who lapsed for over 6 years.
Okay.
Can I have a motion?
If you want to keep it simple, somebody can say so moved.
Yeah.
So moved.
Second.
Second. All right, everybody asked the way, approved the way I described it, say aye.
I,
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Oh, boy, this is, well, we know what we're doing here, thank goodness, right? Thank you. So the last item we have on our agenda relates to retired status. And when we were in our last, I see a hand up there, my friend.
Yes, before you get started, I've been going in and out talking to a gentleman up at our front desk, and he had gone lapsed and now is retired because he got an offer for a public accounting firm. And he just wanted to say a thank you to the LRC and the board for their work and rule changes, so he can come back and work for the season.
Okay.
That was it.
I've heard that from several people saying, that they want to just come back. They want to come back, not full time. They just want to do some work. They're doing it under the supervision of somebody else. And they appreciate having that opportunity. So anyway, thank you all for that work. So while we're talking about retired status, we've really have a pathway, and we know what somebody can do in a public accounting firm. And we were really quite mixed in our last meeting about, we kind of said what a non-licensee could do worked in a public accounting firm. When you think about what a non-licensee can do in industry, government, not-for-profit, they can be a controller, they can be a CFO, they can do lots of things that they don't have to be a licensee for. But we were really struggling. Is that really appropriate to do as a retired individual and as a quotes retired CPA when you're not doing any CPE? We took it to the board, and I think the general reaction at the board was, well, if they're doing something that a non-licensee could do, let them do it. But at the end of the day, it's probably misleading if they hold out. And I think what we might ask Angie and Martin to do is, I think the same way we have a one line, what you can do in a CPA firm, that we add to the rule on retired status that a retired CPA may do in industry, government, not-for-profit, anything that a non-licensee could do. However, because that individual is not keeping current on CPE, that they should not hold out as a CPA retired. And I think that I think if this committee is comfortable with that, then we make that recommendation to the board, and as a clarification on our rules on retired status that we've been working on this year.
So
And
as
Mark,
your response, can I just add one contextual piece from the board discussion to just flesh that out?
Yeah.
I think Ray did a fantastic job describing it, and Ray is right that the part of this was about the CPE, but Ray, I think you really captured it. I was really glad that when you just spoke that you used the word misleading, because that was a substantial part of the board's discussion, that the board's concern really evolved around, if you're not in a public accounting firm and you use the title CPA retired, right, that the public is not going to understand the substantive differences between a CPA in active status versus inactive status or retired status. All they're going to hear is that's a CPA, right? And that was really, I think, one of the fundamental things that came out of the board's discussion, which then led to the board is basically saying they don't want to restrict them from doing what the non-licensee can do, but they felt really uncomfortable with them throwing the CPA retired title around in that setting.
So may I ask you a question for understanding?
fire away.
I've got a client who would love to hire a CFO or a controller. And Ray, in a weak moment, said that he would do that in a very weak moment. And so as the client's interviewing him, they say, well, you're a CPA, right? How does Ray respond to that? He's in the normal world, he said, oh, no, I'm a CPA retired. Well, now has he just held out for a position that if he wasn't a CPA, he could certainly have, but the client now knows he's a CPA retired, doesn't understand what that is. How does that not holding out piece work?
And that's a really excellent question, because to me, and this is, I can't speak for the board because you're now getting into very specific scenarios, and Angie just stepped out of the picture and she would actually get really nervous right now, because effectively what your question does is take a generic piece that we're talking about in rule and applying to a specific fact scenario. And she gets very nervous when we try to answer those questions. And I suppose that's give her an opportunity to return and for her to become actually concerned.
I'm
right?
sorry, I was having a coughing fit. So
No, that's
No,
You
that's fine.
want me to ask my question again so Angie can get concerned?
Yes.
So Angie, here's the question I asked. I have a client who's looking for a CFO. Ray would be drop dead awesome. In an extremely weak moment, he agrees. And so I introduce him to the client, and he introduces himself as Ray Johnson. The client goes, "Oh, well, aren't you a CPA? I've heard, because you taught at Portland State. Weren't you on the board of accountancy at one time? You're a CPA, right?" So
Was a CPA.
was a CPA, but that's true. But he's CPA retired, but he can't claim to be a CPA. He can't say he's CPA retired. If they ask him if he's CPA retired, he can't answer that question truthfully.
I mean, you can say, I think what the board was wanting was like, they don't want people signing things CPA retired. So I think it's like, they're basically, he can say, I'm a retired CPA. I was a CPA, it's the status. And then when it comes down to it, like when it actually comes, like if we were to ever, we couldn't really discipline. I mean, that's a true statement, right? Like saying they just don't want you writing it after your name, basically is what it comes down to.
Not on your business card,
this is-
not using it after your name.
Right. And if as CFO, the company prints a business card for me, it doesn't say CPA, it doesn't say CPA retired, it just says Ray Johnson and my contact information.
Okay, thank you, because that makes sense to me.
Because I think there's an opportunity that the person should be able to answer, you know, what's your experience? This is my experience, and I've gone retired. Yeah, retired means I'm not doing any CPE anymore, or, you know, or what, I don't have to do CPE, right? I may continue, and, you know, that I can talk about the CPE I do with my employer. Do or don't do, but I think at the end of the day, what you're not doing is holding out to the public at large.
And
The
Jason-
rule allows a CPA retired to hold out as long as the retired is in the same font size as the CPA.
Yeah, that's what they want us to take out.
Oh, I was up front helping and just, sorry, I missed that.
Yeah.
They want that taken out.
And Jason, this may only give you barely warm comfort, but the reality is, from what I've seen around holding out cases over a long period of time, is that what the board tends to go after is what I call the rub in your face factor, right? So it's usually the much more blatant, like I'm letting this title drip all over everything. It's on my letterhead. It's over there. And then if they're not, if that particular conduct is not permitted, right? It's usually not the scenario that you were describing, where you have essentially, number one, if you want to be really specific about the facts, in the fact scenario you described, it was actually you saying that Ray had that title. It wasn't Ray saying he had the title, which also comes in on an evidentiary basis, because Ray didn't say he was a CPA retired. You told Ray, right? So that also would make a difference, because it was actually not Ray saying it, it was actually you saying it, right?
Or the client asking and him honestly answering and explaining, yeah, I'm a retired CPA.
Exactly, and basically saying, but I don't use that because I'm not, you know, because the board expects me not to use that because I'm no longer actively licensed, and so that's in the past, right? And that's not holding out, that's just explaining to a client where you're at, right? And that's very different from letting it drip all over your signatures, all over your letterhead, and so on.
So I'm explaining, I'm explaining to the client, here's my skill set, right? Here's what I'm, you know, doing to keep that skill set current or whatnot. But I'm no longer actively licensed. And with respect to and I don't want to be telling the public at large, I'm a CPA, because I don't have that active license.
And if that's permissible, I'm comfortable with that. That allows Ray to be a CFO.
And there's a reason, and basically what we're saying is we've got people that don't have my background that are being CFOs, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, it allows me to do that if I choose to do that. You all have to know that my wife would probably put a gun to my head if I made such a decision, but
Well, she wasn't in the room when I made that.
yeah, she'd probably say, you have to withdraw that decision, I think.
So I think what we're saying is cocktail party discussions are okay, but business cards are not.
Yeah, it's
And
really
and I think there's an expectation that cocktail party discussion is clear and straightforward about what the person is not. What CPA retired really means.
I like
Martin.
the clarity of saying they can't hold out, because when it's silent, people will and do. They want to take advantage sometimes of the fact that they had a CPA and splash it on things. So I do like the clarity.
Mhm. The clarity without preventing them to perform services that they would be excellent at.
So they still
the
have to
word.
maintain their retired CPA license with the board in order to stay in compliance with the board. They just can't advertise it anywhere in private industry. think that's fair.
They can't advertise it anywhere, private industry or otherwise.
So I think what we're talking about here, Martin, in what we've discussed with respect to CPA retired, and we've got a sentence on what a retired CPA can do in public practice. I think we added another sentence behind that, what a retired CPA can do in industry, government, not for profit, that they can do anything that a non-licensee could do, but they cannot hold out as a CPA retired.
And that would hold true whether they're working in a CPA firm or private industry, just anywhere across the board, they can't hold out. That's a question.
I'm seeing people nod up and down, their heads up and down.
Yeah.
So that's we should make that clear for both sectors.
Because I think wasn't the concept of CPA retired to allow people to have that title if they wanted to volunteer on boards and things like that, so that they could indicate their former status. But this is saying if you're employed, either in public or industry, you can't hold out because you're not maintaining that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the original intent was to allow them to do it, but the board was very clear that they just thought you shouldn't hold out, period. And I don't want to go down the path of saying you can do it if you're volunteering and you can't, because that would be,
I don't want to go down either.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure, quite frankly, that there will be some folks in that community that will not be happy about the not holding out part because of just the level of prideness around having been a CPA for a really long time. So I do expect that there will be some pushback in some of our comments if we're going to go down the road. But I don't think that's that's not a good reason not to do it. Because
so let me ask the question so we've got clarity here. If I'm on a NASBA committee, can I say CPA retired?
You can say it, but you can't sign your name. Ray Johnson, CPA retired.
Okay.
So again, it comes back to you can't hold out, and the holding out.
And if NASBA publishes a committee roster, can it say CPA retired?
I mean, no.
Because I mean, right now I could do that.
Right, and the rule allows for it right now.
So again, this kind of goes back to, so then why would we have a retired status? Because
yeah, I mean, we created the retired status to allow people like myself to retire, but still hang on to what I've done for a long career. But I'm doing it in a volunteer capacity. I'm not doing it in a paid capacity.
Right.
yeah,
So
I think I want to step back and say I'm okay with people holding out in a volunteer capacity because that's what it was intended to do.
yeah, I mean, I mean that was not what the board was saying, so I think we would need to.
I don't know that the board got into that level of detail. We were really focused specifically on people who were employed in industry and government during that conversation.
I agree. I agree. I'm not sure I would feel comfortable. I don't know what the board would think if confronted with this particular scenario. I certainly agree with you, Angie, that the board was very clear about their discomfort about folks holding out, particularly in this private industry setting. But the example that Ray just gave, I think that I'm not convinced that the board would say you can't ever for CPA retired status. I think we're going to have that discussion at the board level in terms of where the board wants to draw the line on that on that piece.
I think what I'm hearing from the committee is the committee's distinguishing in large part between a lot of volunteer work that retired CPAs do and what somebody does when they're employed. And I think the real concern was, you know, in that employed status that I heard at the board. So the recommendation of this committee I'm hearing, and I'm going to throw this out there and challenge me, please. But what I'm hearing is the committee likes what we've had in retired status for a number of years. And we don't want to modify it. We don't want to take away what's currently there. We wanted to allow somebody in public practice to do what a non-licensee does under supervision and review. And in industry, government, and not-for-profits, we felt it was appropriate for somebody to be employed doing what a non-licensee is doing. But we've got real concerns about being employed and holding out.
So going
So
down that road of what is employment and regulating that is going to be
So essentially,
really
it kind of, so essentially what I'm kind of hearing is if they're doing the work for compensation, they cannot hold out. However, if they're doing it on a volunteer basis, they could hold out. And the point of this status would be to allow a retired person to continue doing this work without running afoul of the board's rules. And essentially, if they want, this would be an incentive to, if you are employed, receiving compensation for this work, and you want to hold out, you need an active license, right? And so that kind of leans that way, that provides that extra incentive to say, you really shouldn't be working, you know, in a, well, yeah, receiving compensation for the work without an active license, if you want to advertise yourself as such. So that, I mean, thoughts?
Yeah, I think you've captured kind of the thoughts. This is going to have to go back to the board for more discussion, but I think hearing from you, Martin, do you have, and Angie, you have a gist of what this committee is recommending?
Yeah, no, I think I get where the committee's at, and I don't know, looking back at my memory of the board's discussion, that the board got to that level of clarity that we just did in terms of where the committee wants to draw the line, right? But I think it gives us a pretty clear, hey, if you're compensated, don't hold out. If you're a volunteer, i.e. not compensated, then you can still use your CPA retired piece. And I think that's a really pretty clear dividing line. And we'll see whether the board takes it or not, right? But that's a pretty straightforward recommendation from the committee.
As far as administering that, Martin, do you see any snags? Are there any other angles that we should think about while we're talking about this issue?
Well, I don't want to put Angie on the spot too much, but you know, when Angie, you voiced concerns a couple minutes ago about how can we regulate what employment means, right? I think we moved away from that a little bit by moving it from employment and the definition thereof to whether or not compensation exists. And I'm hoping that that might become a little bit simpler for us to deal with, because whether or not somebody is compensated, and I get it that compensation can take different forms, so that gets a little bit, maybe it's complicated still, but it should be easier than the employment approach.
Then you're going to get into the, I guess, I mean, yeah, I mean, I just, this is one of those ones that will just, this is one of those ones where I feel like it would be very important to have clearer lines, because people will, it will turn into us, you know, pushing. I mean, we already have people that push the boundaries with the with the retired status, using the retired status in ways they shouldn't use it already. And so, but regardless, like, I mean, we could take it to the board and see what they say and go from there. I don't think that I never like to go down the route, like we've run into that before. We're talking about whether somebody's compensated or not compensated. If they are compensated for doing their friends' taxes, which they really probably shouldn't do, and signing it as retired CPA, like they're not supposed to do that. I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's one of those things that could become a regulatory problem, but we can figure it out. It's not up for me to decide. I can skip the board, the pros and cons.
And just to be clear here, we're not talking about the activities that that person could perform. This is purely a concept of holding out, whether they state that they are a CPA retired or not, or just leave it. I mean, yeah, I understand like wanting to have that, you know, behind your name, but I would hope that like if you're volunteering in that capacity, like, you know, whether you can or can't wouldn't change your interest in volunteering. Also, a lot of those, you know, like if you go out to a website, a lot of it will have the person's name and then it will have some background about that person as well. And in there, it sort of feels like you could say, oh, they were an active CPA. I don't know what you would or would not be able to say in that, but to describe your experience a bit in that way.
Because there's nothing saying like NASBA couldn't say like Ray Johnson, former CPA, or CPA licensed from 1999 to
no, sure, to 2005, yeah.
And they could do all sorts of things. It's just, you just can't say Ray Johnson, retired CPA. That's all this would do. So there's plenty of other ways they can say that, express that somebody was a former CPA. They just don't say Ray Johnson, CPA retired.
Well, this is going to be a challenge because I think the original rule was put in place to allow people to say CPA retired, and around that, when the original rule was crafted, you know, retired was designed to mean retired. It was designed to mean that you weren't coming back to work in your firm, and you weren't coming back to you weren't retired meant retired. And retired meant, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm doing work as volunteer, and the original rule kind of described this is what you can do, and it kind of, you couldn't come back to your firm. So I think we would upset a lot of people if we took away something that was there and has been there for some period of time. So I think this may be a continuing discussion, and Jason, you'll be at the board meeting hopefully in February, and you get to listen, and then it may come back to this committee again. I don't know.
I will simply say, because I can simply say that factually without weighing in on the substance, right? I have, unless there was a legal necessity to do so, I have never advised any one of my clients in a regulatory setting that I've worked for as an executive director to do a takeaway of something that previously existed.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens in government. When you take something away that you previously had, people get really upset, and it's true at all levels.
So in that line, then so since they weren't able to go and work for compensation prior to, saying in this lane that we have now added, you cannot hold out, but in the lanes that you had available to you before, you still can, would be consistent with that.
So notwithstanding board counsel's reservations about us kind of splitting the thing, that's exactly, I think, what I'm hearing from this committee. And that, I think, is also, if the board were to agree with that approach, you know, a way that I would want to explain it out there, so that we're not taking anything away, but essentially the adding of additional options of what you can do with that status comes with that price.
Because the other prices, of course, you could go back to active if you want to hold out.
Right.
Well, and I think it's consistent with how we envisioned this. If somebody's going back to a CPA firm and they're, for instance, reviewing tax returns, they're under the supervision of somebody else. They probably aren't having a whole lot of client contact or talking to new business or doing anything like that. They're coming back and they're just adding a helping hand.
Yeah.
I think that's the way that's what we envisioned when we crafted the rule.
Yeah, and let's not forget, we made it a lot easier for folks that are coming into the firm as retireds, right? And then realize they really want to hold out, they want to get back in the game. We just made it much easier for them to get back into active status.
Martin, do you have what you need to go to the board?
I think I do. I will work with you, Angie, notwithstanding that I know this probably didn't make you 100% happy where we landed here. But I'll work with you on the language piece there. But I appreciate you on the first two taking the lead on writing, because I'm still in super catch-up mode.
Yeah, I mean, it's already in there, so there's no reason to do anything to the retired rule right now. I think we just need the board to decide what they want. Because their direction, while it didn't go into the nitty-gritty of it, was, something different. So I think we just have to take it back to them at that point.
Yeah.
All right. Do we need Angie, do we need a motion at this point? Or is the discussion we've had sufficient for you and for?
Yeah, because there's no draft language or anything at this point. So let's just take it back to the board to ask them if that was really what they wanted. So no motion, sorry.
All right. I think we've resolved that one. Is there anything else that people want to bring up for the good of the order? I'm just taking a moment to kind of look ahead then. What I see, my own vision, I'll welcome Martin's view. I think we've done a lot on the rules. What we're trying to do is finalize the kind of the last piece of rulemaking. And I should say that advisedly, because there's never a last piece of rulemaking, but this is kind of we're closing the loop on a lot of things, and with this next exposure of rules that will potentially be effective July 1. And then with all of that in place, there's going to be some heavy lifting, because after this set of rule changes, I think the focus of conversation turns to the next legislative session. Mm-hmm. And there are issues related to inactive CPAs. There's a whole host of issues that we've talked about that if they were really going to influence change, it's going to have to come legislatively. What comes down the road with respect to potential changes in the Uniform Accountancy Act are going to be important to keep your eye on, because there's a lot of active discussion nationally about what are the pathways to licensure, and you're going to get to take a look at that. But that's what's ahead once we get past this. I think the big heavy lift next is 2025 legislative session. It's been a pleasure working with all of you. I've really enjoyed this. You've been great colleagues, and I want to tell you the conversations we had today. We've sorted things out with good examples. We tried to think through how this really works in practice. There's a nice breadth of discussion that every one of you have brought to the table, and I thank you for that ever so much. And with that, I think I'm going to call this meeting adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ray. Have
Thank
fun
you,
in
Ray.
Australia.
You're
Great,
welcome.
thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.